we're going to be talking about the intersections between drug policy reform movement and the psychedelics movement. This is a really fun little clip from a blog posting that came after a global psychedelic dinner we held in Victoria at the end of April, and I think it kind of encapsulates some of the new ways of portraying the psychedelics movement. We know that the drug policy reform movement has made significant advancements in areas of human rights, public health, social justice, and until recently, there's been little explicit focus on psychedelic drugs and the people who use them. So what we're going to do today is provide an overview of the different kinds of initiatives being carried out in this intersection of psychedelic drug policy reform. So our methodology in 2015, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 30 key informants, some that were working exclusively on psychedelics, some that were working exclusively in more mainstream drug policy reform, and then we supplemented these interviews with reviews of organizational websites to look at who was doing what and who had the potential to engage in psychedelic drug policy reform.
Thanks, Andrea. I'll just make a comment, actually, by way of introduction. I'm an adjunct professor in the School of Population and Public Health in British Columbia. I do also work for the Ministry of Health in British Columbia, but I'm here speaking as an academic in that capacity, not in any way representing the views of the government of British Columbia. So these are some of the key organizations that we spoke to or whose websites we looked at. It's by no means necessarily exhaustive, but we tried to sort of capture the main groups that are active in these respective areas. So the themes that we have pulled out, we'll go through each of these: scientific research, public education and knowledge exchange, public health and harm reduction, Indigenous rights, freedom of religion and thought, stigma and coming out, and then issues around cultivation and production and political advocacy. So with respect to scientific research, obviously the schedule and status of the substances we're talking about in the UN conventions has resulted in regulatory burdens that have impeded clinical research for decades. Fortunately, that's starting to change, but there's still a sort of zeitgeist of concern about this area, especially among some of the scientists who work in this field. So the stigma against psychedelic substances has dissuaded research. Also, the fact that they aren't patented has been an obstacle for funding. And I would argue also the short courses of treatment, the sort of pharmaceutical model ideally has a patented medication that's dispensed daily in perpetuity, which is going to maximize profit. Whereas if you have a medication that's not patented and requires just a couple of sessions and then essentially the full benefit's going to be realized, that's not a very profitable model. So that's a challenge for funding as well. There's also epistemological questions around Western scientific values and whether traditional Indigenous knowledge practices involving substances such as ayahuasca or peyote could be a challenge with respect to scientific approaches. And then legal challenges in the sphere of law and policy also are going to be influenced by the testimony and evidence generated by scientific research. So there's definitely a strong impetus to do more scientific research to advance the policy reform agenda. And I think that was a sort of universal claim, is everyone agreed that science is going to help us pave the way for any kind of change, whether it's involving more or less political advocacy along the way as well.
And so just to note the example here about the efforts in Canada, just an example to show how difficult it can be and how much more expensive it can be to do scientific research on psychedelics. And in terms of the organizations that we review, there's a key area was looking at public education and knowledge exchange. I think we've heard a lot and seen a lot of media clips at this conference. Media analysis is a particular interest of mine, and thinking about how do we craft messages that are going to be the most effective in advancing the drug policy reform agenda with regards to psychedelics. I think in the 1960s, there was definitely mainstream media coverage that went from being, very interested in research, shifted to being much more sensationalistic. And I think that the key difference today is that with the advent of the internet and social media, it's much more difficult to put a lid on the different testimonials and alternative counter discourses around psychedelics. So I think there's a lot of potential. So some organizations and groups focusing on these areas, just a few noted here. Also, conferences, other events, looking for ways to translate the psychedelic research information and also to create community are important activities that people are engaging in as well. So here's our fun joke in the middle of the presentation. So what are the other areas? Building on the harm reduction history within the HIV and drug movements, another key area of psychedelic drug policy reform or activities has been focusing on facilitating, promoting interventions that can prevent or mitigate risks of physical or psychological harm from medical, non-medical uses of substances. So just to provide an overview of some of the activities, so there's a building on the movements around HIV and substance use, but also a bit of a different twist within psychedelic harm reduction and public health efforts. There's an acknowledgement that within rituals, ceremonial contexts, that this is a type of historical proto-harm reduction method that can enable protective factors against adverse outcomes. But as these traditional practices have been spread globally, fidelity to these types of rituals has not always been maintained. So there have been some efforts made with regard to establishing protocols for syncretic practices, but there's no universally accepted professional standards or oversight mechanisms at this time. So that's an area for future work. Psychedelic harm reduction takes forms a lot online. What are these substances? What can the effects be? A lot of testimonials, sharing of information. Psychedelic ER, we heard some about this yesterday at music festivals, looking at Zendo Project, Shambhala in Canada. And then another area, I think, as there's more novel substances becomes even more tricky is drug checking. We know that a lot of the risks come from the fact that we do not always know what's in the substances that are circulating. And so how do we use different mechanisms to check for consumer safety? So some more efforts could be made in that regard.
Emergency response. Yeah, psychedelic ER, psychedelic emergency response. Another area that holds real promise for policy shifts is the area of Indigenous rights. Recognizing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People includes ceremonial and cultural, scientific technologies of Aboriginal peoples. And it's important to remember that drug, and especially plant prohibition, is a legacy of colonialism. This goes back to the ancient, to the ending of the Eleusinian Mysteries and the advent of the Catholic Church and the repression of witchcraft and herbalism, but obviously manifested in the past century in the modern global drug control system that still holds some of those colonial legacies at the core of their enterprise. So the movement towards political autonomy and territorial sovereignty is, in some places at least, I'd say Canada is a good example of this, increasing respect for traditional cultural practices. This is manifested in the area of drug policy with respect to the Native American Church's protection of religious freedom and their use of peyote as a sacrament. The example of ayahuasca being declared a cultural patrimony by the Peruvian government. And then it's interesting to see there's also pan-cultural indigenous exchanges happening with respect to sharings of medicines. This is an example of a policy document from Canada that includes reference to ceremonial practices involving tobacco, peyote, and ayahuasca as examples of traditional and medicinal practices that hold considerable interest outside of the traditional territories from which they're based. Also, freedom of religion more broadly. The core value of liberal democratic states has some tensions with respect to trying to balance human rights, or religious freedom in this case, with criminal justice agendas and public health agendas, all of which kind of pull in different directions. But we've seen some successes in some places with respect to the Brazilian ayahuasca religions, the Santo Daime and the União de Vegetal, winning legal cases in places like the Netherlands, Spain, and the United States. So there's potentially still further promise to be held in that area.
A third area around human rights that some organizations and groups are working on is more this perspectives that psychedelics encompass a freedom of thought or cognitive liberty. So thinking about how some people who use these substances don't necessarily want to go the religious route, may not have a pathology that fits into the therapeutic framework, but want to, as Bob Jesse says, be better than well. So there's some movements to actually push for looking at cognitive liberty in terms of consciousness enhancement, creativity, and somaesthetic experiences. And this area, I think, for me was one when I've been talking about it with a lot of people because it does represent a little bit more of a privileged standpoint. I think people who are using substances in certain areas were very criminalized or repressed. Cognitive liberty is kind of, the cherry on top, yet is it the first place to start in terms of psychedelic drug policy reform? As mentioned, I think in some of the other slides, stigma remains an important obstacle. There's a lot of the people we spoke to talked about how do we learn from the queer liberation movements? How do we look for, how do we come out of the closet? So there's some different activities that are happening. National Psychedelic Coming Out Day, this new hashtag, Psychedelics Because. So looking at how do we use testimonial and the patient experience or personal voice to destigmatize? How do we all come out of the psychedelic closet? And make statements on that account as well. I think that within the context of psychedelic drug policy reform, this kind of idea is really very much in its infancy. I think there's some comments yesterday about how we still are seeing the same representation of people with a bit more power. So how do we actually expand this to think about bringing people of color's voices, queer people, women, Indigenous people's voices even more to the forefront within drug policy, psychedelic drug policy reform?
So beyond the protection of people who use drugs, there's also recognition that it's people who are involved in production and distribution, and the issues related to that need to be addressed as well. So with respect to plant-based substances, the protection of habitats and sustainable cultivation and harvesting of these plants is a critical issue, especially for peyote and iboga, where there's potentially real threats to the sustainable, and especially as more and more interest is sort of generated through the scientific research. People are seeking these kinds of things, which may further jeopardize plant species sustainability. The challenges around sourcing pharmaceutical-grade substances has been a challenge for advancing the research, looking for good manufacturing practice or GMP medications for use in clinical trials has resulted in exorbitant costs. Rick mentioned the cost for MDMA has escalated something like 10,000% in the last decades. And then, of course, there's import-export challenges because of the 1988 Convention on the distribution of trafficking of psychoactive drugs in the treaties. There's going to be recognition that we need to advance the production and distribution across different countries. Can there be a mechanism set up for import-export? This came up in with respect to the advancement of ayahuasca policy in Canada when there was a preliminary decision made in favor of religious freedom, but the challenge that ended up holding it up for many years was whether or not import-export arrangements could be negotiated with the government of Brazil. Ultimately, it proved to be very, very difficult to the point of not being successful at all in the end. But that just is one illustration of whether crossing transnational borders is possible and how to address those issues as a policy reform issue. More broadly, within the United Nations system, the World Health Organization is responsible for obviously health-related issues. So a big concern is the treatment of substance use disorders and other mental disorders. The promise that's held in psychedelic medicine could be a real opportunity for the World Health Organization. Also, they have a list of essential medicines. There's I guess a hope that these substances, if the preliminary research, the pilot studies do pan out and larger, more scaled up advances, that the list of essential medicines might be expanded to include substances that are currently Schedule 1 and have no accepted medical value. The International Narcotics Control Board, as I mentioned, could be important in allowing for import-export arrangements and the access to supplies of controlled substances for medical and scientific purposes. UNESCO, ICEERS has been working with UNESCO to look at the protection of cultural traditions and cultural heritage with respect to plant uses. The UNGAS 2016 meeting just happened. Not much mention of psychedelic substances there, but there was it was heartening to see civil society representation from the psychedelics world was present in a way that I think it hadn't been before, and it bodes well for 2019. The next UN General Assembly meeting will be happening, and perhaps the psychedelics voice will be further strengthened and advanced in that meeting.
So political advocacy can also happen at national, subnational, regional levels, which some organizations are working more at that local route. So looking at lobbying, how do you influence political party platforms, looking at professional organizations such as colleges of physicians, looking at within the healthcare system, funding agencies, other bureaucrats, and of course looking at social movements, protest movements. The example of 920 here from just this last year, a coalition of groups came together to organize events, public events around the world to advocate for better knowledge and understanding and movement of policy around access to psilocybin for medical uses. And we're also seeing another area is legal advocacy. I think the stage was first set historically looking at actions to protect legal freedoms. Those is the Native American Church, UDV examples from the United States. I think we might see more in this bit of branching out in this area in coming years. Also, as Ben spoke about this week, the Ayahuasca Legal Defense Fund is a great example of collective efforts to protect individuals from criminal prosecutions. And just late last night, we got an email actually saying that Tony Krebs from Emma Sophia, Terry Krebs, after speaking at a marijuana conference, a public event last week, then was taken into custody and checked for being intoxicated, was not intoxicated, and then they raided their home and found 0.8 grams of psilocybin mushrooms. So we might have, unfortunately, another precedent set in terms of repression. Also looking at people who have been convicted of nonviolent drug crimes, how do we seek pardons, being an important area forward. So as Rick noted, we're looking at the intersections between psychedelics, drug policy reform doesn't come without tension. So these are some of the tensions that our informants spoke about. So one is the opportunity cost. There's only so many resources. Should we be moving it from overdose prevention, HIV prevention to psychedelics? How do we actually move through that tension of finite resources? As mentioned also, this fear backlash against scientific research, it's happened before. How do we push for drug policy reform without having the door slam in our face once again? And the one that I found really quite interesting is this whole concept of good drug user, bad drug user, or good drug, bad drug. So within psychedelics, we also feel these substances are very special. I think in the ayahuasca community, you'll hear, oh no, ayahuasca is not a drug. I'm not a drug user. So if we're looking to have solidarity between more mainstream traditional drug policy reform, how do we stand in solidarity from some of the folks who might benefit most from psychedelic therapies, people who have severe addictions to heroin, cocaine, who are very marginalized, without saying, oh no, I'm not that kind of drug user, this isn't that kind of drug, and reinforcing stigma against very marginalized people. So how do we work through that tension, I think is also an important question.
There's also questions about whether the cognitive enhancement potential of these substances, if in the wrong hands, might actually be socially or culturally pernicious in some way. Yesterday, Roland Griffiths mentioned the Manson family as one example. You could imagine, CEOs of big oil companies learning to better extract fossil fuels and exploit, perpetuating an infinite growth paradigm with finite resources, using psychedelics as a tool for that way. In my opinion, at least, not necessarily the best use of these tools, but it was also raised by other informants as a concern. Lack of universal access, this is really a movement happening in the global north. Will that perpetuate health inequities that are already differential between richer countries and poorer countries? And will psychedelics, if they're sort of realized in medical potential, reach broader populations of people? The decolonization of mainstream drug policy reform to create spaces for Indigenous leadership, we already mentioned that. And then questions on ecological pressures on plant species for meeting increased demand as these potentially become more popular with rising interest and scientific awareness of their potential benefits. So with that, we'd like to say thank you to, first of all, the informants that we spoke to and the people who've been working in these respective areas of psychedelic renaissance and policy reform. And thank you to the Open Society Foundations who supported us in undertaking this project. Thank you. So I don't know if how much time we have for questions, maybe one or two.
What were you saying just now about oil producers using psychedelics?
Sorry. Well, so I mean, this is, I think, more my personal opinion, but you know, if somebody who's using psychedelics for a cognitive enhancement purpose to, you know, better realize a vision that they have, but their vision is itself, and I use the oil example myself, I think, you know, climate change and fossil fuel industry is something we need to move away from rather than, you know, double down on and become better at. And it's potential that somebody could use psychedelics for the purposes of, as I say, perpetuating an infinite growth paradigm, which is where we need to be moving away from. So that was what, and it was more of a political comment of my own rather than, but it did come up from some of our informants. Question here?
By the way, it's very interesting to Google CNN money, billionaire LSD. Then you get a presentation of CNN money, which is a rather nice source, actually, in this case. How Silicon Valley is using LSD to solve certain problems. By the way, for the other people who are interested, funding, yeah, because these people were called as billionaires, so and they state that a lot of their money comes from the use of psychedelics. So it's payback time.
Yes, good point. Thank you. Oh.
I just want to add one point that some of the early founders of Facebook have pledged multiple millions of dollars to psychedelic research.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Rick.
I gotta let Bia ask. Go ahead, Bia.
I really enjoy your presentation. I think we could use the opportunity to talk to Rick for New Psychedelic Science Conference for this lack of indigenous leadership. It's ironic that you get all this like ayahuasca shamans coming to North America, but we never have Native Americans on this. So I think it would be nice that we invite, you know, like a Native American from the U.S. To talk about peyote. That's one thing. And the other thing that maybe you can comment on, I think that the greatest challenge is the idea of cognitive liberty, because it works better for certain drugs than others. I wonder if you want to comment, like, it's good for idea to say, you know, enhance your mind and free your spirit for things like ayahuasca or peyote, but how do you do that for crack or methamphetamine? Like, how do you unite? I don't know if you want to have...
I don't think we ever saw the potential for that moving over to other substances. It seems to be something that's really in the psychedelic realm amongst more privileged people who want access for those reasons. I don't know if you want to speak more.
No, but I think that was identified early on. I mean, Richard Boyer was one of the early sort of developers of the idea of cognitive liberty, and recognized that, you know, the argument it's not exclusive to psychedelics. It could be applied more generally. But I think the impetus for the cognitive liberty argument comes deeply rooted from the psychedelic sort of sense of freedom and the sort of full capacity of expanding one's consciousness. Is limited if you don't have access to the appropriate tools to do that. So I think there's a really compelling case to be made, and I hope further work will be done in this area by legal scholars. It's, I think, an important, I mean, without freedom of thought, what other freedom is there, right? That's the most foundational freedom in my estimation.
Hi, I'm Stephen Reed, Director of the Psychedelic Society in the UK. We've decided the best way to fight for drug law reform is actually not to fight. Psilocybin truffles are legal in the Netherlands. That is an incredible opportunity. We've actually recently started these psychedelic experience weekends, taking people from the UK.
Question? I can hear it here.
Can you, sure? We've recently started taking people from the UK to the Netherlands to have these experiences with psilocybin truffles.
Yeah, just ask for your thoughts on perhaps whether simply letting these substances speak for themselves, if you like, and taking advantage of favourable legal situations in certain countries is one of the best ways forward. Thanks.
I think that's certainly why ayahuasca tourism is flourishing in the global south, people going places where it's legal, yet I think it does, that tension comes up again about who gets to have access, who can cross borders, and then it remains in the hands of a privileged few. So yes, of course, sidestepping that, but I think we heard a great presentation, I forget the gentleman's name, around novel psychedelic substances, that this is another outcome to prohibition. So we actually do need to address this so that we don't end up with substances that we don't know what's in them, we don't know the effects, and that people are being harmed. How much time do we have?
I was wondering if you could report on some of the general conclusions from the recent special session in New York, and whether they have really shifted to a human rights approach from their, yeah.
So the question is about the UNGAS meeting, the UN General Assembly special session. I think the consensus is that the sort of real shifts that were hoped for weren't realized. There were, however, individual countries that made very progressive types of statements. I'm proud to say including Canada. But there's, I think, a lot more work that needs to be done in the broad area of drug policy changes and embracement of human rights as a foundational element of the architecture of our drug control system. So, the overall picture is not as hopeful as one might like, but I think there's important cracks in the wall that we need to continue working towards spreading further. So I think we might be out of time. Yeah. So we'll have to cut off, but we're available afterwards, and we'll pass it to next presenter.